Hey y'all, it's Michael, and these are the books that I read for November, for Nonfiction November. Let's get started. The first book that I read was The Boys in the Boat, 9 Americans and Their Epic Quest for Gold at the 1936 Berlin Olympics by Daniel James Brown, narrated by Edward Herman. The title of this book really explains what it is, but it's about the University of Washington rowing team during the 1936 Olympics. This book does follow the typical book structure of a sports-like movie drama where they are the underdogs and then they eventually rise up and become this great athlete type of story. I didn't mind that as much because I really enjoyed those stories myself, so I really enjoyed how this book was structured wise. It shows them from their startup, because the way that the rowing team is structured, like you have your JV team, your junior varsity, like your first league. This book shows how they become this underdog and they essentially become such a great team. Now, while this book focuses on the team in general, this book really does hone down to one person essentially, and that's Joe Rance. This book really mainly focuses on him because the author interviewed him, and that's where he got a lot of the meat of the story from. Joe Rance's story is so interesting. It's really engaging, and I was glued to his life throughout the whole story. Like, I could not literally stop listening to it because the book is presented really engaging and riveting and just so intriguing that I could not stop listening to it. And while this book jumps around, because it comes back to Joe and then it goes to like the coach and then it comes back to him and then it goes to another person, I think it's done so well. The author does a really nice job of weaving all of these strings of like people and plot points that I think it works really well, that it achieves its job of like being really inspirational and just telling like a really good story in general. I also really love that this book makes rowing so interesting. It points out a lot of the philosophy of like not only rowing but like teamwork and sports in general, and then it talks about like how the boat is made, which was so fascinating, and then the science of rowing in general, about how, okay, I'm gonna try my best, but how about like how the angle and the like the turn of the paddle, like how it touches the water, and oh, it's so fascinating, and it's presented so well that I completely understood the coach's mentality and the team's mentality and how they were able to achieve this accomplishment in the end. My one little gripe about this book is it's like this backstory of how Hitler is coming into power, how they're setting up for the Olympics, and how this regime is about to like gain its full power. I feel as though like while he built it up really great, like the crescendo to the build-up is fantastic, I think that it doesn't reach the gravitas and the height that it's attempting to achieve, because for me anyways, it fell flat towards the end, and how, I'm trying to be vague because I don't want to give too much away, but how it doesn't really have like a consequence almost. Like that's just a small gripe. I could see what the author was trying to do. I think it was also great to see, because you know the Olympics was just on this year, that it was great to see how the steps to get to the Olympics. I think that was just fantastic because I don't know that much about it like that, so I just thought that was like a great thing to learn about in general. Out of all the nonfiction books that I listened to for Nonfiction November, this was one of my favorites because I only had two, like I think that they were so good, and this was one of them. I gave this 4.5 out of 5. I would really highly recommend it, especially if you're just starting out with audiobooks or nonfiction in general, because if you don't listen to a lot of nonfiction, this is a great book to start with because you can see it, like the way he describes things. Like there are especially parts where it felt cold because they were practicing in cold, and I was like, So yes, I would recommend it. The next book is Ask a Mexican by Gustavo Arellano, narrated by William Dufresne, Christine Marshall, and James Herrera. After the height of The Boys in the Boat, I was expecting really something comparable, like the greatness of that book to this, and I thought I was gonna learn a lot about like Mexican culture. But so this book is about Arellano, who is a writer from the I wrote it down, from the California OC Weekly. It's like one of those section of the newspaper where someone sends in a question and then the writer answers it, kind of like a love type of thing. But this one, it was mainly about like asking a Mexican, basically a whole bunch of ignorant people asking stupid ass questions. And then Gus Arellano, like it was almost as if he was making fun of them for being stupid, like asking these stupid ass questions. And some of those, I'm not gonna lie, some of these questions were really ignorant, almost to the point of being racist. I was like, what? It was like one question was like about rice, and I was like, what do you mean all cultures eat rice, not just Mexicans? This is normally presented in like a weekly magazine, and I think that reading it weekly works better than in a book. These questions into like different categories, like about clothing, about music, about food, which was obviously my favorite chapter. Eventually what happens is that it gets really repetitive, and that's because some of the questions that the people ask, it felt like someone already asked that, like just in a different wording. You know how like when you're writing an essay and you have to reach like 500 words but you only have 400, so you just start repeating everything but like in a different form and different words? That's what people tend to do, and that's what they're doing here. At one point I was like, wait, I already heard that question, you already answered that. Also, I do have to talk about this. Humor is a subjective thing. Sometimes people find things that are funny, some other people don't. It's really subjective. I felt personally that some of the answers that he gave, I understood that he was being sarcastic because some people ask really stupid, ignorant questions on here. But I felt as though sometimes some of the answers and some of his humor feel right with me. Like it almost was like it made me do that side eye where like, like I didn't feel. I didn't laugh. Basically, it wasn't funny. And I thought some of them were offensive. Now, again, I think maybe it was supposed to be like that because it's almost as him being sarcastic. But then again, I myself felt offended, and now I'm gonna let you know I am not Mexican, but I felt offended, and I don't know if that was just me being me or if that was because I just didn't get it and it just flew over my head. It reaches a point when you start to get towards the middle of this that it just felt like it was too much, and that's why I think this works better in a weekly form. Like if I would have known that if it was like if I was reading this as reading this as a physical book or listening to this in an audiobook, I would have taken it in chunks. Like after one section I would stop, do something else, like read something else, another book, and then come back to it. Like do it as a weekly thing. Experiencing it all in one clump was just tiring, and you felt drained at the end. Now I'm not gonna lie though, I did learn surprisingly. I was like, oh okay, I didn't know that. And I did learn a few like history stuff, and especially like about Mexican culture in general, so I did really appreciate that. I gave this 2.5 out of 5. The next book that I listened to was Unbroken, a World War II story of survival, resilience, and redemption by Laura Hildebrand, narrated by Edward Herman. It's a biography-ish, kinda. This has been turned to a movie. I did not see the movie. This book is about Louis Zamperini. Oh, I wrote it down so I won't pronounce it correctly. Zamperini. This is his story about how in another World War II story, he is a pilot and he was flying over the Pacific Ocean, and then his plane crashed essentially, and with a few of his fellow soldiers that was with him in the plane, basically they get stranded and they get captured by the Japanese. It starts off like at his childhood, which was fascinating, really interesting. The other interesting part of this too was that he was also in the Olympics. He was actually a runner. And see, this is the great thing about nonfiction, since I've also read about other nonfiction books from World War II, like the in the Garden of the Beasts by Eric Larson. That talks about a family that lives in Germany, and actually this book is mentioned quite frequently in a lot of World War II novels. So that's like one of the main things that I love about reading nonfictions, because essentially some of the stories will start to overlap. And Unbroken actually mentions the Olympics, and I was like, oh, the other team was there too, because we get to really see his life essentially. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this book, it is really long, and once he becomes captured, it tends to, for me anyways, it got tedious, and I was like, oh, okay. But I really felt that he was such a courageous person, because there are parts where he gets tortured and like bad things really happen to him, and him trying to escape. I also really enjoyed how during World War II here, we get to see being captured and seeing how being in that system can really affect mentally and physically someone, because oh my gosh, he went through a lot of things. I gave Unbroken 3 out of 5. The next book is The Good Nurse, a true story of medicine, madness, and murder by Charles Graeber, narrated by Will Collier. As I go along from these books and letting you know what I think about them, the word tedious is gonna pop up a lot. I'm just letting you know. This is about Charlie Cullen, who was a nurse who was dubbed the Angel of Death. Basically, was killing patients. Like, he just kept killing patients. And he did this for years, like not months, for years. And he was never arrested, prosecuted, caught. Like, it took them so long for him to finally get the due diligence that he deserved. So that was basically it. This book talks about how these two detectives basically hunt him down, and how he has been doing this for years, and doing this not only for years but like through several different hospitals. He was doing this in several hospitals, which was blows your mind. This also talks a little bit about his life. We get to see like his relationship with his girlfriends and like his family, that type of thing. I think the one thing about this book is that first off, I really wanted more reasonings and more in-depth about why he was doing it, but I also did really enjoy how we got to see the system of being in the medical system, like how he was able to get away with this, because the hospitals were so keen on not having a high death rate that they were willing to let a lot of things slide. How like getting medicine, about like the process of getting giving and getting medicine for patients was really interesting. But I thought this book, after a while, it was just like, okay, we can keep moving on. Again, it got hashtag tedious. It was just like, okay, we can move on now. And after a while, I was just like, okay, I kind of got it. Like, it was just like, So yeah, I gave it 2 stars out of 5 on Goodreads. Yeah. The next one is Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain, narrated by this person. I forgot to write it down on here. But yeah, first off, this is such an interesting topic. Well, it talks about 2 things, but it talks mainly about being an introvert and then an extrovert. And she gives like a lot of examples, a lot of cases, a lot of characteristics about like the past of how these things were diagnosed, like a lot of the backstory of being an introvert, like the psychology of being an introvert and extrovert, and how society portrays, like in the media, the society, how it wants us to be portrayed essentially. So I thought that it was such an interesting topic. The thing about this though, for me anyways, after a while it got tedious again. I felt like after the 2nd chapter, I kind of got it, and then it just kept going and going and going. Some of the cases that she does present is really interesting, but after a while, I was just like, okay, I kind of understand it, and it was just like, like I was just like, okay, I got it. I gave it, I believe, 2 stars out of 5 on Goodreads. So. Alright, the next one is The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer by Siddhartha Mukherjee, narrated by Fred Sanders. This is literally all about cancer. It talks about cancer in the beginning, like the word, where it comes from, about cases with cancer. This book is all about cancer. First off, it is interesting, and it is very science-y. That's not even a word. It's very science focused. So it talks a lot about the science of cancer, how cancer starts and like how cancer manifests essentially. I have a biology background, so I do know a few things about cancer. We did a project on garlic and the association with it with cancers. Well, audiobook wise, it doesn't explain like some of the basics of biology. If you were not that familiar with science or you're not that interested, it can go over your head. I would recommend this book if you are really interested. Not gonna lie, it almost felt as though I was back in class and the narrator was like a professor and it was telling me all about cancer. Some of the cases were so interesting. My favorite one was about the cigarette industry, how about smoking can cause lung cancer. I think that was my favorite. And like how the cigarette industry tried to cover it up essentially. I thought that was so fascinating. Overall history of it, I really did enjoy, but I'm not gonna lie, it gets tedious. It is really long, and at the end I wasn't like wowed by it. It wasn't like riveting. It just wasn't like you know what I'm saying? I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Right, the next one is one of those 2 books that I thoroughly enjoyed, and that is American Ulysses, A Life of Ulysses S. Grant by Ronald C. White, narrated by Arthur Morey. God, this was such an interesting biography. In one of my previous vlogs, I actually confused Robert E. Lee and Grant, but no, he was the general in the during Civil War of the Union. This was so insightful about Grant because the main thing that I knew about him essentially was like he led the victory for the Union to win the Civil War. This book is structured really nicely. The first part was about like leading up to the war, and then the actual battles. Oh my gosh, there were so many battles. And then the second part would probably be like Reconstruction, and then his later life with his presidency, and then like his life after the presidency, because he was elected for 2 terms. I live in Georgia, and you do see a lot of Confederate flags even to this day. So if you know a great biography about Robert E. Lee, please let me know. I would think it would be a great contrast to this book. I also want to read White's other novel that he wrote about Abraham Lincoln. It almost seems like as if he was like in the middle with Grant. He presented a lot of the great things that he did, but then it also presented him, since we're looking at it now in the future, like some of the things that he's done as a general and a president wasn't like that great, and how he handles some of the situations that he was put in, like with some of the scandals that he like that fraud scandal that he was involved with. My favorite part of this was that how we get to see Grant personally, like not just as a president, that as like how I see him, but some of his like his personal life, like with his family, about his religion, like his views on religion. And then the one thing that I really loved about this and I learned was about how he approached situations differently, because apparently a lot of people classified him as an introvert, and the way he handles and how he thought of things was like an introvert way. And that was so crazy, because since I just finished listening to Quiet, I thought that was like, oh, that's really, really interesting. Like he just wasn't like, let's go do this now. He actually like took time to think about it, like try to think of the outcome. I also really liked how we got to see how being a president was really hard, especially for Grant. I didn't know that he actually wrote like his personal memoirs, so I would be really interested to read those. This book does include a lot of battles, like obviously it does play an important part in his career essentially. But for me personally, I kind of wanted more about his personal life, especially after the war, like the Reconstruction and then his presidency, and then after his presidency. I thought those parts, I kind of wanted more of that, because it almost felt as though that was what I wanted personally. I think it's just like me wanting to know more about him. I really did feel as though I got to know him as a person. And so I think that that's what the book does really well. I didn't also know that he had to deal with a lot of things during his presidency, like the Ku Klux Klan, Native Americans relations, and like oh my god, the scandals, like his oh he I learned a lot about his life. I would recommend it. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. If you read any of those books or listened to them, let me know what you think about it. Yeah, so until then, I'll see you guys so later. Bye!